Welcome in. I am Desmond Clark, the host of Principles of Winning, where we interview highly successful entrepreneurs, executives, athletes, politicians, and entertainers to discern their principles and their disciplines that they apply in their personal and professional lives to create the mountains of success that they've experienced so we can continue developing our personal and professional success playbooks for our own lives. Before we get to today's guest, we got to start with the interview that we had last week. I just want to thank Derek Thompson, the founder of TNT Creative Group, for coming on last week and giving us a great interview and dropping so many insights on his three most important disciplines that has helped him win in life and business. This episode of Principles of Winning is brought to you by Des Clark Speaks. Des Clark Speaks is your preferred keynote speaker and corporate team development specialist. We help executive team leaders like you create pinnacle team success by establishing principles of winning. If you want to learn more about how we help executive leaders like you to build championship level corporate teams, go to www.desclarkspeaks.com for more information. Hey, and sign up for our free executive roundtables. Now let's get to my guest today. I'm very excited to interview this guy. His name is Andrew Farrant. Andrew currently serves as the Chief Marketing Officer for Global Jet Capital, a business jet leasing platform. He's originally from Montreal, our great neighbors up north. But for the past 30 years, he's worked in various leadership positions within the business aircraft industry. He is joining me today from his home office in Tampa, Florida, to open up about his principles of winning. Let's bring Andrew on. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm well. Thank you. Thank you for having me today. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yes, sir. And before we get into that, I just want to just talk about the power of the internet and specifically the power of LinkedIn. We've never met each other. We connected through LinkedIn. We exchanged a few messages here and there. Hey, I sent you over something that interests you that you thought, hey, maybe that may be something I want to do. We had a conversation and here we are now. So for people out there who, don't think that LinkedIn work or, struggling, keep going because I've made so many connections through LinkedIn and Andrew is just one of those connections that I've made. So Andrew, welcome again. And thank you for coming on. And let's just jump right into it.
Sure.
I like to start off by asking my guests, hey, what are you excited about? Something that maybe you just finished up or something that you're looking forward to here in the near future. You have something that's very personal for yourself that you're excited about. Tell the guests tell the viewers what you're excited about.
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me. And I guess, in fairness, you did prompt me with this one, and I gave it a little bit of thought. And I think, despite how much I like golf and the upcoming golf season, I'd say the thing that's got me kind of, most revved up right now is really watching my kids. So
Yes.
I've got two young adults in the house. They've both been away at school for a couple of years. My daughter came home. She's been working in the Tampa area and is applying for her master's program, which is going to take her out of state. So she's been home for a while, which is nice. And my son was studying out near you in Orlando at University of Central Florida and decided to change his degree from computer science over to cybersecurity. And that's brought him home because he's going to transfer over to USF. So for the first time in like 4 or 5 years, we've got them both here. And they're not kids anymore, right? And so we've got, two young adults moving in and out of the house, working. We try to sit down for meals as often as we can, but just getting their insight on how they see the world, how they see current politics, how they see, what looks like is next for them, it's kind of put me into a different mode. I mean, I'm just turned 59 years old. I hope to work for another, decade or so, but I'm at the tail end of this thing. They're just starting. And so it's really exciting for me to listen to them talk about how they see their futures, the amount of energy they're putting into things. And I have to say, I mean, it's they're navigating a very different world than I was navigating at their age. That's for sure.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm just gonna assume and tell me if I'm wrong, but hey, you as dad and then mom, you guys have done a wonderful job with your kids. Can you tell me what are some of those? Because I know, hey, sometimes raising kids is a struggle and you go through the ups and downs. But what are some of those key components that you and mom have instilled into them to help them be as successful as they are at this moment of time in their life?
Well, it's a good question, and goodness knows, I think if you talk to any parent of young adults, there's a dozen things I'd like to go back and do over again. But I think we moved down to Montreal when they were very young and came down to the States, and I think one of the things that I think we did right was we made sure they got back to family as much as they could. And so, despite the fact that it was really just the four of us here, we're in the Midwest for a while, down in Phoenix, now over to Florida. We've been here since '09. We've always had a steady stream of family coming through. We always made sure that we were up every summer in Montreal, spent Christmas in Montreal. So making sure that they felt they had some roots, they knew where they came from. I think it was important. The other stuff is what you'd expect, right? Hold them accountable. Try to make sure that they understand the implications of the decisions they take. I've always been a really big advocate for critical thinking. And I've really encouraged, and my wife has as well, we've really been partners on this. We've really encouraged them to think critically. And so, as they've gotten older, and different social issues, political issues, religious issues come to the table, I've always encouraged them to look at things from 360 degrees and never, don't read something somebody tweeted out and think that that's reality. If it's interesting to you and it compels you in some way, get deeper. Understand what the other side of it is, because there's, whenever there's a conflict or, something requiring resolution, there's always a variety of ways to look at it. So we've really encouraged that. And I'd say aside from that, hard work and, honestly, just, being kind, right? Being kind to people around you, being thoughtful of your environment. They're good kids. We're really proud of what we've done. But probably the last thing I'd say is, and this is just language, right? When they came home with good grades, when they did something good in the context of sports or whatever, always encourage them to be proud of themselves, right? It's one thing,
Yeah.
I always share with them that I'm proud of them for that, right? But I'm always going to be proud of them. You should be proud of what you just did. And I know that's a nuance, but I think it's important for kids. They need to know you're behind them and you're watching and that you are paying attention and that you respect them. But teaching them to respect themselves, I think, is equally important.
You mentioned taking accountability for your decisions. When your kids made decisions, whether good or bad, how did you reinforce that with kind of coaching them through that? Give me an example of something that you would do or your wife would do as a parent to reinforce or correct decisions that were being made by your kids.
Yeah, it's a good question because we weren't we never hit our kids in this house, and whether that's right, wrong, or indifferent. I
Mhm.
mean, people make those decisions. I know that some of that's cultural, some of that's upbringing. For me, and this actually translates over to the way I manage people in business. For me, it was about really establishing an understanding of whether you know what you did was wrong,
Mm.
right? Like I could sit here and I could say, I'm going to take away this, or I'm going to spank you, or I'm going to do whatever. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the individual understands what they did wrong and the implications of that. And so we probably spent more time really trying to get them to understand that and understand why that was wrong, so that the next time these situations evolve or these choices have to be made, they're being made from a position of understanding, not just, I'm not supposed to do this or I'm not supposed to do that. Did you know why you're
Right.
not supposed to do it? Well, not really. I just know my dad's gonna freak out if I do that. That to me was never a win, right?
Hmm.
To me, that idea is it's sort of like that whole leading versus driving change. You can force people to do what you want them to do as long as the threat's around, right? What really matters is, will they do the right thing when the threat is no longer present, right? Say threat, it could be leadership, a
Well,
manager, whatever, right?
consequences.
Yeah,
The
consequences,
consequences.
right?
Yeah.
Like, will you do the right thing regardless? And really what it boiled down to for us. I think really understanding the difference between right and wrong, like here, right?
Mm-hmm.
That that
Absolutely.
was that was the big idea, I think, in our household.
And if I was to ask you, and I think I already know the question to, I mean, the answer to the question, when you look at yourself as a successful successful man, or say, hey, I'm winning in life, do you factor in how your kids are performing as young people into that overall equation of, am I winning? Am I successful?
Yeah, and that's a tough one, right? And I say that because, uh, my athletic career didn't resemble yours at all. But I mean, sports was everything to me as a kid growing up, right? And so when my kids got into sports, you run this risk of trying to live vicariously through them, right?
Yes.
And I can remember coming home from certain events and my wife pulling me aside and saying, this is not you competing out there. This is them, right? And that's an important lesson. So, the answer to the question is yes. It's really hard as a parent not to factor your kid's success into how you perceive your own success, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like globally speaking, right? There's family, there's financial, there's your career. All of these things make up what makes you comfortable and happy, right? And so, yeah, it plays a role. But I've had to really work on myself to accept my kids for who they are and not to continually, sort of look at them and judge them through my experiences
Mm-hmm.
and what was important to me at these different stages of their life. I'll share with you, this is kind of interesting because a couple of years ago, probably 2 years ago, excuse me, a little bit of seasonal allergies here.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at both of them and thinking to myself, like, where was I when I was their age, right?
Yes.
My son, I don't know, something happened at school he wasn't happy about, he's feeling down about himself. And I'm thinking to myself, like, dude, like you're so far ahead of where I was at your age, it's not even funny. And I sat down and created a little kind of Excel package where I went back into the best of my memories, trying to figure out, okay, when I was 16, where was I and what was I doing? 17, so on and so forth. I sat down and it gave me pause. It gave me a chance to sit back and really recognize how much further ahead they were than I was. Now they've had opportunities that I didn't have, but the good news
Mm-hmm.
is they're taking advantage of it. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a really critical lesson in life is to not squander opportunity.
Absolutely. So you said you often think about, where was I
Yeah,
at my at the same juncture that my kids are now, comparing the two. Let's go back to those days, because
yeah,
obviously, like, you've built yourself into someone that can say, hey, I've had some success, I've done well in life. But there are principles, there are habits, there are disciplines that led
mhm,
to that. Take me back to the early times. Maybe it was mom, dad, maybe it was some things that you went through, had to overcome, some lessons learned.
yeah,
um, First, tell me, what are some of the most important principles that you have for success in life? And then,
mhm.
uh, where were those principles developed early in life?
Yeah, so like I said, we grew up in Montreal, and the family's from west part of England. So my dad grew up during the Second World War, literally across the street. You could hit a 9-iron from the front doorstep of his childhood home into the British Aircraft Company. And
Whoa, okay.
so, he's born in 32. By the time the war's raging, he's 8, 10 years old, and they're bombing his neighborhood incessantly. And so he didn't get much of an education. He and the kids in that neighborhood would get shuttled off to, boarding schools and just wherever they could house these kids safely during
Mm-hmm.
these bombing raids. And so in England back then, what we call high school, they called grammar school. If
Mm-hmm.
you passed the test to get into grammar school, then you could, continue your education. But if you failed, as many of these kids did, you went straight into a trade. And in his case, that was the British Aircraft Company. So he was an apprentice in there, probably at 12 years old. Um, And, the English were really pretty particular about how they went about these things. So my dad came over to Canada in the 50s, kind of went back and forth as a family, finally settled. Everything we did in that house had to be to the standards that he had learned in the British Aircraft Company. So if we were hanging a picture on the wall, there were plumb lines and levels and I mean nothing. I'll never forget watching him paint a room. He would go, like, if we were painting a room, we would have to wash the walls down with like some sort of soap, and then dry that, and then there'd be 2 coats of oil base, and then 2 coats of. I mean, it would take weeks, right? You think about what we do now. I mean, you roll in with a can of latex and your room's painted in like 3 hours. I mean, but that was the way we were brought up, and it was really frustrating. And my brother and I used to pull our hair out all the time. But he basically created an environment where, if things weren't done properly, they weren't going to be done at all. And he was notorious for just saying, look, if you're not interested, go, just leave. I mean, he was capable of kind of blowing a stack. I mean, every parent is. But generally speaking, the worst thing he could do is just tell you, that's it, I'm done, right? Like, go do whatever you're going to do. You're not of any value here. And that always struck me. And I guess it kind of stuck to me. And, that kind of work ethic and doing things properly really permeated the way I went into the workplace. Now, on the other side of it, my mom was, much more chill than he was. She was just a really sweet woman, kind as kind could be. And I think the 2 of them counterbalanced each other. And so I came out of that upbringing with this high appreciation for what you could call perfectionism.
Okay.
But with the edge taken off of it by my mom. So, because anybody who's been around perfectionists know they'll drive themselves and everybody else crazy. And, I mean, it's great to do things well, but when things slip into perfectionism, I mean, probably heard the expression, perfection is the enemy of good, right?
Mm-hmm. Is the enemy of progress.
Diminishing return with anything you do. Spending 3 days, to paint an 8x12 bedroom you've reached a point of diminishing returns, right?
Right.
So I think those are the things that really, kind of locked in early for me.
And so if you were to break that story down into 3 principles or 3 habits, what were those 3 things that you drew from your family upbringing? Can you name those particular things?
Yeah, I think the first thing is if you're going to do something, do it right. Mm-hmm. Right? Don't bother going into any situation. And we've repeated that to our kids numerous times. I don't care if you're shoveling the driveway, cutting the grass. If you're not going to do it right, don't do it. And on top of that, try to take some pride in it. I mean, okay, maybe it's just cutting the grass, but find a way to do that well and to take some pride in doing it well, right? Mm-hmm. Run around and, cut the grass, leave half of it undone, don't do the edges. I mean, no, if you're going to do that, don't bother, right? And then when you're done, give yourself the opportunity to sit back and look at it, even if it's something as obscure as or as meaningless as cutting the grass. Look at it and go, yeah, look, I did a good job, right? And I think the third thing is really organization. We grew up in an incredibly organized household. And, somebody said to me, one of the guys I played football with years ago, we got together for beers in Montreal, and he was saying, oh, man, you've done pretty well. I always knew you would. You were so organized. And I never really saw it like that. But I reflected on that afterwards, and I thought, it's probably the one skill that served me better than any other throughout my life is just being able to be really organized and on top of things and not surprised by things and, planning things out, and I'm taking organization, much broader, but, being able to, plan for worst case scenario, just really being on top of your game. I think is critically important. You and I chatted briefly last week, and I said to you that my football career, which does not parallel yours in any way, but I played through university in Canada, and played from the age of 8 years old, and I love the game. I
Mhm.
love the discipline of it. I love the fact that more so than hockey, which I played just as much of, one guy couldn't have the impact in football that one guy can have in a hockey team, right?
Right.
Because everything's got to be meshed and everything's going to be working together. And I played in a top tier high school program in Montreal in the inner city. And when I got there, that was the first time we got to, breaking down film and game planning effectively. And, went through university coach for a couple of years. But I often thought that the best lessons I ever learned for business, I learned from that perspective of
Mhm.
going in and really understanding your opponent, your battlefield, call it your marketplace, if you will, being able to break it down, understand what your strengths and weaknesses were, how you're going to leverage them. And then most importantly, what do you do when you launch your great plan and 2 minutes later you got punched in the mouth and your middle linebacker's gone, and
Right.
now it's got to be different, right? And so I always felt that that and the organization around it and the structure um, really played a huge role in my business career, still does today.
Yeah, and you said a number of different things here, as far as how you break down your upbringing and how that led to who you are today. We talked about brand a little bit
Yeah,
when we talked. So doing it right, taking pride in what you do in your work, the organizational skills, that ultimately became your brand. Is that something that people looked at you and said, "Hey, here's why we want to promote Andrew. Here's why we want Andrew to be a leader"? Did it have to do with that those things that you just said and the brand that you became as a leader?
yeah, it's a good question. There's a few things I'll touch on there, but I did not have anything of a great education. I mean, I went to Concordia University in Montreal primarily because I wanted to keep playing football, and I had no clue what I was going to study. Went in the English Lit program, moved into communications, and developed an interest in that. But when I left, I had a degree, but if somebody had said to me, "Can you describe to me what marketing is?" I wouldn't have had an answer for you. I was really a little bit clueless, and I managed to get a job through a family friend, which was just sheer luck. I got a job at Bombardier, which at that time was on its way to becoming the third largest civil aircraft manufacturer in the world. It was an environment that was just filled with change. Bombardier, just brief history, had bought a company called Canadair off of the Canadian government.
Mm,
And up until that point, so this is like mid 80s, up until that point, Bombardier was a skidoo maker, and they had rolling stock. They were building train cars in Europe. It had nothing to do with aviation at all. And suddenly they bought this company in Montreal called Canadair, which built aircraft. And they were suddenly becoming an aerospace company. So the place was a little bit chaotic early on. I got a job there, and it was just a job. But I think what I managed to do over about a 2 or 3 year period was just demonstrate to people some of the things that I talked to you about, the work and the organization and the focus, and started to develop a little bit of I guess a brand, to use a better term, or a reputation, right?
mhm.
And then I got hired into one of the sub business units, which was focused on business aviation, into like a marketing coordinator role. But I think, and I don't mean this to sound too boisterous, but every every time they gave me something to do, I found ways to improve upon it, and I found ways to deliver, and I found ways to put structure and organization. I mean, if you went into Bombardier today, none of the things that I'm going to mention would be. I mean, that is a very buttoned down organization as it is today. But at that time, with the growth it was going through and the amount of change, there were a lot of things that just weren't organized. And from a marketing perspective, there weren't effective budgets and plans and things of that nature. And I started to put these things in place. And the next thing I know, I was kind of rising in the ranks, and I was, starting to lead teams. And from that perspective, I just used a lot of the skills that I had built, leading, football and hockey teams, right? I was never the best player, but I often became a team leader just because I think that focus and that ability to drive results and stay organized. And so my career kind of came out of nowhere. There's an old English expression, the pup that grew up at the pub. I was kind of a pup that grew up at the pub. And, I had this vision in my mind that I was going to run the marketing organization for this company and the business aircraft side. And lo and behold, ended up running it. And at that point, started to wonder, okay, well, I've accomplished this. Now what am I going to do? I think I was probably in my like late 20s, early 30s. And I remember thinking to myself, this is what I'm going to do for the next 25 years? I can't do that.
Right.
And the other thing was I was surrounded by people with really stellar educations. People who'd, gone to business school at Wharton, people from Penn State, a lot of the people in Montreal, some of these French kids go to the best public school, best private schools like Brébeuf, and then go down to the States for their finishing degrees. And so there was all this academic excellence around me. And I was walking around with this communications degree from Concordia and wondering, could I actually translate this, or is this just something that I lucked into somehow?
Uh-huh.
And that's what led me to go to the States and really make big career changes, because I wanted to know if I could take that brand and apply it elsewhere. And so far, it's worked pretty well.
So, Andrew, what I'm hearing, and I know you won't take this the wrong way, is that you're very unremarkable.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah. And so, with that being said, I had an interview last week where my good friend Derek said that most of the time when you're coming up in the ranks, we overestimate the people who are on a higher level than us and think that they are some type of supernatural being because they have this title. And what I just heard from you is that, man, I'm very unremarkable. I tell people the same thing. As an athlete, I was very unremarkable. I scored an F at my combine. I scored a 35 out of 100. And then people could go and look this up. I talk about it all the time. Keep scrolling down. If you go look up Desmond Clark combine stats, you'll see the F. Keep scrolling down. You'll see about 15 to 20 guys that score higher scores than I did.
Mm-hmm.
I outplayed all of those people. I had a better career. I had better stats. I played longer. And it just comes to those key core things that you have to be willing to do. Are you willing to work on your craft? Are you willing to do what's necessary? Whatever that is. Put in the extra days studying film. Put in some extra work in the weight room, which I didn't often do, admittedly. That was one area where I was very, very average. But I did study my craft. I studied my footwork. I knew that I wasn't as strong as the defensive ends. So let me look at these smaller tight ends and see how they get it done. Let me ask questions. Shannon Sharp was the best person I could have played beside and under when I first came in because he was undersized. But being willing to learn all of those things, with the point being, you don't have to be some whiz or some prodigy to get to the top of the top in life and profession. Just got to be willing to do the work. And one thing I want you to comment on, you said that you were given jobs, you were given things to do, and you looked at those things and you said, okay, here's how I can make this better. So you brought value to the table. And as you brought more value, people seen you as a valuable person. And it seems like that's the way you kept getting promoted and people wanted you to give you even more. Would that be true, that you brought value, they seen you as valuable, and they kept giving you more responsibility?
Yeah, I would say 100%. I think I caught everybody by surprise, including myself. And if you'd have asked me when I got that entry level position at Bombardier, what was my career path, I had no clue. I didn't even understand what that meant. I was a guy who managed to get a job somewhere and was going to make the most of it. Um, and I think what happened over time was I started to apply some of these, I guess innate capabilities I had, whatever. And yeah, to your point, people started to notice. And then what starts to happen is your confidence starts to grow around these things. Truthfully, I felt like I was surrounded by a lot of low hanging fruit. I mean, I will say one thing, which I think is really critical. You know, you say, what is success, right? And there's a lot of different expressions out there. One that I like is, the intersection of preparation and opportunity. I think there's some truth to that. But if you leave luck out, I just think there's always a modicum of luck in it. Now the question is, when you get a break, do you recognize the break and can you take advantage of it? And I think that's really important. But I got a break, and that break was to get a job at Bombardier at a time when the job market in Montreal was not great. I had a communications degree, which was focused on television production. The entire degree was done analog, and we were just switching over to digital. So it was almost like my degree was meaningless.
Obsolete.
I was obsolete the day I walked out the door. And I ended up, like I said, with just a job, but I found my way through. And I think through hard work and, just applying what I thought were common sense solutions to issues, it started to work. And then I think the next thing that happened was, you get an opportunity to lead people, and organizations like that usually start small with somebody who's coming up through the ranks, give them a small team and see how they react, right? And I think that's where I really started to shine, because one of the things that I'm absolutely adamant about is that no team operates because of the efforts of any one individual. Teams have to operate, through collaboration and, coordination. And I always looked at my role as a leader basically to open the door to success for the people that work for me. That was my job as I saw it. And I look at leadership, I look at management in the context of a company as a job. It's not, one of the things that you see often in high-tech production industries like aviation is a lot of it's very engineering driven, right? And so what often happens is they take the best engineer and of the engineering pool and put him as the head of the engineer or her.
Yes.
And now what you've done is you've lost your most valuable engineer potentially, and you've put somebody into a role that he or she may not be well suited for. But it was, if you think back to the, 80s, 90s, that was the only way to progress, right? Now what they've learned in a lot of these environments is that, you can continue to pay these people as individual contributors, right? And maybe they ultimately make more money than the person that's leading the team, because those are specific qualities. Management is a craft. Management and leadership, they are a craft, and they need to be worked on. They're not just titles that get bestowed on people so that they can make more money, or they shouldn't be. And I always believed that in my heart of hearts. And so I developed a reputation. Part of my brand was that I ran really high performing teams that were like happy and having fun. And that was, stop me if I'm on a tangent here, but
no, keep going. I like this tangent.
If I go back to my upbringing again, my dad was not a lot of fun to work around, right? Like if we were working on something that was difficult, you knew it, right? I mean, and you could feel it in the air. And I always thought that wasn't necessary, that you could still work hard and have a lot of fun. And so throughout my career, I always used humor and lightheartedness to try to break tension and to put people in a better environment, because I think people work better when they're comfortable. When people are uptight, now again, it's like a bell curve, right? It can't be so loose that it doesn't matter. But if it's too tight, I don't think you get the best out of people. And that's, I guess, the reputation I developed as a guy that, I ended up, as my career grew, I ended up with a lot of very mature people working under me. I mean, guys who were 20 years my senior. And
Right.
I think if I'd have gone into those environments and sat down and said, all right, buddy, this is how it's going to be, right? It's going to be my way or the highway. I don't think that would have worked. But the fact that I sat down with these guys and said, hey, look, I get this. This must be a bit of a, kick in the stomach for you. Um, but let's figure out how to make this work and let's figure out how to make you successful in this context. I think that paid dividends for me.
I'm a big John Maxwell person. And one of the things he talked about is being a multiplier. And I believe that's what leadership is.
Yeah.
When you have your own job, your own responsibilities, you can add to, right?
Yeah.
But once you become a leader, now you if you have 8 people, 12 people, 100 people that report to you, that's multiplication because now it's not just you doing one thing, it's you helping 8 people do 8 things or 12 people. So when you think about leadership, do you think about it in that type of way? And then what are some of those we talked about some of those personal qualities that drove you individually. What are some of those habits, principles as a leader that help you to be a good leader?
So I think transparency is critical.
Mm,
I think, being transparent with people. I think, especially in companies, and this gets more complex over time, right? I mean, you think about the old style corporation. You go work for Acme Dynamite Company, and you spend 35 years there and get a gold watch, right? And you do the same thing every day. Companies are changing now. Leadership teams are changing. Private equity's coming in, buying out companies. I mean, there's no kind of steady state to any of this.
hmm
I think in that context, especially, but I think it's true in any context, you as a leader have to be as transparent as you possibly can with the people who work for you. They need to understand what's at stake. It's critically important to them. It's their livelihood. It's the health care for their family. It's their career. And everybody's in a different place. But I think the idea of holding back information and not giving people access to the big picture only reduces them. And I think that being transparent about who you are and what's important to you, what moves you, I think is important. I think developing a relationship on those levels, but I think really making sure that people understand the direction of the business, what's happening in the business, why it's happening, why things make sense. It almost goes back to what I was saying about the kids earlier, right? Understand the why, understand the big picture. And I've worked for plenty of people who would sit around and say, well, you can't tell them that, them being the employees, right? You can't
hmm
tell them that. Like, you'll lose them. And you're like, well, no, you're going to lose them by not telling them that.
Right.
You need to get them engaged and involved. And frankly, if you've got news, I'm just making this up, if you've got news about a business that's so dire that people are going to run for the doors, well, then you owe it to them to share it with them, right? I mean,
So they can make informed decisions.
well, exactly.
Yeah.
And so, those are I think some of the things that I think are really critical when
hmm
you're, now layer on top of that the standard stuff. Make sure people understand what their roles are and what their mandates are, and give them an
hmm
opportunity to participate in that. Right. Again, some of this depends on the type of organization you're in. Right. If you're running a factory floor, I'm not sure there's a ton of room for interpretation on, certain positions. But in something like a sales organization, a marketing organization, depending on the industry, everybody brings strengths and weaknesses to a position. And
hmm
so, give them an opportunity to help shape their position. They ultimately will, anyways, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
they're going to focus on what they're good
They
at,
either
and
gonna
they're
do
going
it.
to stay away from what they're bad at, right? So let them
Yeah.
have say and let them help shape it, right?
And either they're gonna do it with some guidance or they're gonna do it by default.
Right.
One of the two is gonna happen. And you would rather them do it through guidance. But let me just push back a little bit on the transparency. Here's
Yeah.
something that I I believe in. Well, I don't believe in. I don't believe in fairness when it comes to business. And
Yeah.
here's why. I don't think that you can always do us right and do us fair all the time. Sometimes they collide. But like you said, you always want to be transparent. But sometimes those decisions that you have to make that's right for the company may not be fair to all the individuals of the company. Would you say, hey, I agree with that in a way? How would you respond to you can't always be fair, but you always have to do what's right. And sometimes when you do what's right, it's not fair to some of the individuals who that decision affects.
Yeah, look, I think you raised a really good point. It's a good pushback. I think well, there's a couple of things. First of all, you're talking about things that involve other people. We've no right to share, somebody decides to leave the company or is asked to leave the company. There's certain things you can't talk about, right? And even in
Hmm.
the context of where business is going, there are times when it's just simply inappropriate to share certain bits of information. But I think the way I would look at it is this 80-20 rule, right? I mean, I would drive towards that level of transparency, right up till until the edge. But to your point, there are times when it's just inappropriate or it's just not going to work. You simply, we're not in a position to share that information for one reason or another. But I
Hmm.
think the idea is in my view, to demonstrate as much transparency as possible, given the
Right.
context of a situation. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And you mentioned also when you was talking about transparency about developing relationships. So a lot of times as we build these skills and we elevate to different levels of who we are as people, we bucket a lot of stuff and a lot of different bullet points into this one bucket. And I think relationships is one of those buckets that we dump a lot of stuff in and never really unpack it. Right.
Mm.
So when you say developing relationships, what does that mean? What are the components in that? Because we hear all the time, hey,
Mhm.
this is a relationship driven business. It's the sales are relational. We hear that all the time, but I don't often hear people unpack how do you actually do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So and again, this is my view of the world, right?
Hmm.
So I'll give you an example. I've got a team of people right now, and we're spread to the wind. I've got people in Connecticut. I've got somebody in South Florida. So most of what we do is on Zoom, and so we have a weekly call, Monday mornings. I like that call to focus as much on what people did over the weekend as anything else. Um,
Hmm.
Sort of like get to know each other a little bit. Now we've been together for a while, so some of that's, but still, I mean, talk about kids' birthdays and whatever. But I don't mean that in the context of like, looking at a sheet and going, okay, well, we've talked about the
Check
birthdays
the
and
box.
but like literally, like, so Desmond, how was your weekend, right? Like before we get into what is on your plate this week and what you might need help with, right?
Hmm.
Best part of the weekend, worst part of the weekend, that type of stuff, right? I have one-on-one, call-ins with each of the folks on my team once a week. Those are Zoom calls. As often as not, those calls really don't get into business.
Hmm.
Now what I don't have the opportunity to do is go by somebody's office and knock on the door and say, let's go grab lunch or let's go get a cup of coffee, right?
Right.
And so I use these check-ins to try to see how people are doing. If something big has happened in the company, I'll make a point of reaching out and say, hey, let's take 5 minutes. I mean, I know you heard everything you just heard, but what are you really thinking? What do
Right.
you does this, does this concern you on a personal level? I mean, professional level, whatever. But in my mind, it's just about getting to the next level. Now, I think all of us in a work environment have to be thoughtful that these things don't sort of get out of control, if you know what I mean. You have to
Right.
be, I think, as a leader, I think you got to be thoughtful about not shoving political perspectives down people's throats or things of
Hmm.
that nature, right? Things that are hot button issues in our society. But I think understanding, where people are at, how they're, heck, we went through this whole COVID thing. I mean, we've all we're all looking in the rear view mirror now, but I don't think there's anybody on this planet who can't who can say it didn't have some impact on their mental health,
Absolutely.
right? You know, So like, how are people doing? Like, actually, because I think if the entirety of the relationship in a work environment is based just on the work, I think you lose a lot. I always say
Mm-hmm.
to people, we go through a very appropriate and disciplined annual performance program at this company. And if our head of HR was here right now, she's terrific, really, really good. I would tell her what I always tell her. If we need this, we're doing something wrong. And I only say that from this perspective. If you and I work together for a year, and come January, I sit down and tell you there's 3 or 4 things I'm really unhappy about with what you're doing, or alternatively, there's 3 or 4 things I'm really happy that you did. If that's news to you,
Right.
then what are we doing? What are we doing?
But that's the way that most companies are run. That
And
they
I think that's
yearly or
unfortunate.
biannually check in. And I
Well,
really feel
and for managers, sorry to cut you off, but for
no problem. Go ahead.
managers who are really lousy at this, right, and maybe don't have a full skill set that a manager should have, a manager of people, then maybe that's better than nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, if you did something great in the office last week and I don't take the opportunity to pick up the phone and call you and celebrate with you the moment I learn about it, what am I doing?
Right. Yeah. I personally coming from a sports world, I personally with my team once a week. We have a game. We call it we just rebranded it and we call it a game review once a
Yeah,
week on Monday. Hey,
yeah,
what went good? What went bad? Did we hit our like weekly um, uh, metrics that we're trying to hit? Let's dive into that. And it's really quick and it's really fluid. And now we don't miss out on anything because we're reviewing every week.
right,
And going back to what you was talking about as far as building relationships, I have 5 things that I really look at. The first thing is, hey, can I bring a positive aura to the relationship? No one wants to be around anybody that's like you said, it's gonna make it hard on them. Oh, it's always tough. Sometimes you have to be tough, but you still can have a positive aura as you're pushing somebody in a tough situation, right?
yeah.
The second thing is, are you bringing value to the table? If you can, we want to be looked at as positive people. I mean, not positive people, as valuable people. So the easiest way to have someone look at you as a valuable person is to bring value. And if you do
Mhm.
that enough times, now you're just looked at as a valuable person overall, right? Now you develop that as your brand. The third thing is to always just be non-judgmental, especially on the outset of a relationship. Give people a blank sheet of paper, let them write their own book instead of you trying to
Mhm.
write the book for them. They may have difference of political views, religious views, whatever views. Be more be more curious than judgmental.
Mhm. I
And
like
and
that.
and and say, hey, all right, you have a very, very different perspective from what I have. I'm just curious on how you got that perspective. And even if it's something that goes totally against what you believe in, they have the right to believe that. And just see, okay, that's what they believe and leave it at that. Don't put judgments on it, but be very curious because it may be something in their background, it may be something in their upbringing, it may be something in their worldview that causes them to have that outcome of whatever it is. And you may understand how they got there, even though that you disagree with the ultimate conclusion. And now you formed a connection through the understanding of how they got there, even though you may not agree with the conclusive thing at the end, but you understand. The and the,
Mhm.
the fourth thing is this: always be encouraging and challenging. And it sounds like you're that type of person where, hey man, I'm your biggest cheerleader, but when I need to be tough on you, I will also push you. I will
Mhm.
also say, you know what, you got Andrew, you're better than this, man. You're, you're better than this, Andrew. Come on. Like, I'm not going to let you slack off because I know you got more. But at the same time, I'm going to be your biggest cheerleader. And whenever I can come by and pump Andrew up, I'm pumping Andrew up. And then the last thing for me on how to build those really significant and powerful relationships is just always be consistent and reliable.
Yeah,
Always
I
be
think
consistent and
consistency is really
reliable
important.
because people understand what they're going to get, and people like certainty.
Yes.
People don't like uncertainty.
Yeah.
So if one day I was speaking somewhere else, and I'm usually a guy, I'm intense, but I'm very, all of those things that I just said. But one day I was having a bad day, and I walked into the office and I told the people, and talking about being transparent, I said I'm having a really bad day.
Yeah.
So if I don't seem like myself today, please excuse me. And I'm probably going to be quiet, more quiet today than I am normally, because I don't want what I'm feeling to come out on you guys. So just starting the day, I want you to know that right up front, right? So that's kind of how I operate, of how
I
I
think that's
feel.
huge. I think that's
Yeah,
huge because I think we all internalize how others are behaving around us. I suppose there's some people in the world who pay no attention to it, but generally speaking, if your mom or your dad comes home and they're in a bad mood, you know it, right?
right,
If the boss
right,
comes in and I think that's huge because a lot of people, like, it's none of their business, right? They don't need to
mhm,
know, right? And the problem is you're wreaking havoc in their minds, right?
right. And like I say, they want consistency. They want
Yes,
reliability. And if you
yes.
can't be consistent and you can't be reliable, I think you owe it to the people that you're leading to let them know why you can't be consistent or reliable for that particular moment or circumstance or whatever it is. You owe it to them to say, okay, today I'm a little bit off course because of A, B, and C. So now they know, okay, this is not him being inconsistent or unreliable. This is him having a circumstance or something that's,
Well, he's allowed
yeah,
to be human, right? He or she is
exactly.
allowed to be human today.
It,
And
it,
I think that's important. I think that's great. I wrote those down.
there was one more place I wanted to go, uh, when talking. Oh, here's where I wanted to go. When you was talking about being on a football team and learning how to break down the opponent and strategize for that opponent. Up on my wall, I have a definition of win, and I went back to the origin of the word. And the origin definition of the word win is to gain or succeed by struggle.
Hmm.
So when you said understand your opponent, it took me back to that, because I was on stage once and they say, why do you feel so confident that you will be able to win in this industry? I say, well, I understand what win means. And I try to identify the struggle. Hey, where are we going to struggle? Where are the things that I don't know? Where is that opponent that I need to face, game
Hmm.
plan around, and then execute a strategy? And like you said, it doesn't always work. But I think if you look at business that way, then now you isolate things that, hey, that's the game now. How do we defeat that struggle? Just like if who you got your favorite team, and for us, when we played Detroit, they had Megatron. They had this big Hall of Fame receiver, right?
Yeah.
That was going to be the struggle. How do we stop him? If we
Yeah.
can't stop him, we're probably not going to win the game, right?
Yeah.
So we game plan around that. And if we did a good job on him, it gave us a better chance to win. So I don't know. Have you ever looked at business that way, of isolating struggles, game planning around that struggle to defeat that struggle? Now is going to give you a better chance of winning the overall
So,
game.
yeah, 100%. First thing I'll say is this. It's been my experience in the business world. As soon as you use the word strategy, people get kind of all hung up, right? Like
Right.
that guy's not strategic enough. She's not strategic, right? Strategy, that's very strategic. Like, the word just gets tossed down all over the place. So I'm kind of a fan of what you do. I like to go back to, so if you go to the Oxford Dictionary and you look at the word strategy, it's a plan to get from A to B, right? And
See,
so,
I love it.
the way I look at strategy, and I've got involved in strategic planning at Bombardier. I've written strategic plans for most of the businesses I've been part of. I shouldn't say written. I've been a participant. I'm usually the person that leads that effort, because you can't close yourself, in a closet with a yellow pad and a Sharpie and write strategy. It doesn't work that way. But if you think about it in those simple terms, right, the first thing that you have to do is identify what A is. And A is where you are, right? In all of the contexts, it's important. You talk about football, there's a whole bunch of things that are already determined for us, right? We know the size of the field, right? We know the rules of the game, right? We know how many players they're going to have, how many players we have. There's all these things that are set, right? But in business, a lot of times we don't understand those things. And so I think it's really helpful for organizations to do really good analysis up front to understand where they are, right? And what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? And what does this battlefield look like, right? When I came into this business, we lease business jets. And so I asked, one of the first questions I asked was, do we have a sense of how big the market is? And somebody looked at me and said, well, yeah, that's easy. Just look at the delivery rate on business jets. And I said, well, I thought half the deals we did last year were pre-owned aircraft. Well, okay, yeah, but we don't really have. So, all of a sudden you're starting to shift the ground a little bit. And so, where you go from there is to understand, okay, well, what's the total addressable market for this particular business? And what's the target market? Where are you going to focus, right? And within the context of that target market, again, so who are your key competitors, right? What are big regulatory issues that might come down the pipe? Like, there's sort of like take an exhaustive look at where you are. Then ask yourself, well, where do you want to be in a year? Where do you want to be in 3 years? Where do you want to be in 5 years? And then with all of that knowledge in place, start to plot that plan. When we launched Global Jet Capital in 2014, so we compete against the biggest banks in the world. So you can't walk down the street in a major city in any country in the world and not see the brands of the banks that we compete against every day.
Right.
And one of our biggest fears is somebody walks into the CEO's office and said, we want to finance this $75 million business jet with Global Jet Capital. And 3 people look around and go, who the hell is Global Jet Capital, right? So one of the first things we knew was we were going to have to punch above our weight, and we were going to have to build a brand. Now, there's 2 components to that at the highest level, right? There's sort of perception and there's awareness, right? And so you have to make people aware of the brand so that they recognize the name, but then just as importantly, what does that name stand for? I always like to use the example of the Titanic. Everybody's heard of the Titanic, but doesn't have very good perceptions, right? The thing sank on its maiden voyage, so that doesn't work out so well. And so these 2 things work hand in hand, and I've done a lot of work on brand throughout my career. And one of the hardest things, if you've got a CEO who gets this and really gets it, then I think that puts a company in a position to build a strong brand through both those elements, awareness and perception. But a lot of people struggle with this. And so one of the things that we like to do is just talk about reputation. And I think when you talk about reputation, then more people tend to get this, right? Because you say, well, what do you want the reputation of this business to be in 5 years? I joined Global Jet in 2017. Company was about 2 years old, had just made a major acquisition, was really trying to find its ground. And we put a brand team together, and that was one of the first questions we asked. Was we went out to the marketplace, got voice of customer, voice of partner, industry perspectives on who the business was. And then we went inside to say, okay, well, what do we, if this is how the world perceives us, how do we want to be perceived in 5 years? And that's how we started to set the map for Global Jet Capital. Now, there has to be a strategic map that underlies that, but these things are very intertwined, right? Today what we know is within the context of our industry, Global Jet Capital is as well known as Bank of America or PNC, which is saying something. More importantly, when people, this is within industry context, we do research on this every 2 years. People look at the brand as one of the most respected brands in the space, which is really critical. Right, but it wasn't done by accident, right? It didn't happen by accident. It happened because the CEO of this business got it and drove this thought process down through the organization. And in the context of brand, the idea is that every single thing that happens, every single thing that's said, every interaction that anybody has with the business is ultimately going to reflect on the brand. Somebody
Mm-hmm.
picks up the phone and calls the office and is treated rudely, that impacts the brand, right? And so getting people to understand all of these things and the fact that everything that we do and say, every action we take ultimately impacts that reputation, can go a long way. And if you've got a roadmap and you're clear on what you're looking to become, we talk about things like value proposition, but making sure that they're credible, right? That they're relevant, right? They're differentiating, that they're enduring. All these things are really critical in that, that strategic work that goes into building a brand. But at the end of the day, I think the easiest way to bring it to people is through the idea of reputation. And
Absolutely.
I've sat with CEOs for businesses that said, well, I talked to so and so and they said I should talk to you about building the brand, but I'm not really sure. It seems kind of, I don't know, do we really need to do this? I said, well, I always like
Plain
to
and
say,
simple, one word.
you and your business are going to have a reputation whether you like it or not. Ultimately, you need to decide whether or not you want to have any impact on that. Do you want to manage that, or do you want that just to happen, by accident? And typically, when left to accident, bad things happen.
Right.
It's no different than your personal brand, right? How do you want to
Right.
be perceived by the world, right? Do you,
It,
want to get up and shave every day, or do you want to walk around with 3 days growth? It's not that one's good or one's bad. It's just, how do you want the world to perceive you, and how do you want the world to perceive your business, right?
it's and that's important. And it goes into everything. It goes into why I wear hoodies when I do these interviews. I'm known as an athlete, and I had to make the choice: do I dress up for this? What do I want people to see? But I want people to see the authentic me.
Right.
I am a hoodie guy.
Yeah.
This
Part of
is
your
what
brand.
I do. And I can still go and I can still run a business
Yeah.
in my hoodie. So I had to make that choice of, hey, how are people going to see you? How do you want to be received? I want to be received just like I am. And I made this clear. Hey, if people don't want to work with me because they perceive that I don't give off the right aura as a business owner because I'm wearing a hoodie, then they're not right for me, right? I have to be who I am, but it's
But
very
don't you also think that in this day and age, we're more like, if you were doing this 50 years ago, right? You'd have to be wearing a shirt and tie,
right,
right?
right.
Today I think we're comfortable that that what we're looking for can come through a lot of different packages, right? Like,
Hmm.
it doesn't, and that to me is, when you think about building a brand, that's important context, right?
Right,
Those
right.
things are important context for how you think about these things. And that to me, we often like to talk about all the things that are wrong in society today. I think that's one of the things that's right about society today, is that we're comfortable, respecting and absorbing information from a lot of different sources, right? Somebody doesn't have to have a tie on and be holding a pipe to be respected anymore.
Well, but here's the other thing. You also have to give respect. And that was going to be the second part of what I said. Like, I'm in my space right now. So I come how I come in my space. But if I go to your space, I'm going to respect your space, right? How you conduct business.
Right.
If I'm walking into a Fortune 500 company and everybody in there, they wear suits and ties. I may not wear a tie, but at least I'll wear a suit and a shirt out of respect, right? Because
Sure.
part of the brand is, hey, you said respect, right? Respect it. And I look at brand reputation, however you want to call this. Your brand or your reputation precedes you, right? That goes out. That's what people hear about you. That's what other people are saying about you. But the other part that you mentioned, which is so important, is once they come to the reality of you, once they get on the phone with your customer service reps, once they meet you in person and have a one-on-one with you, does the reality of the brand exceed expectations, or at least meet expectations?
Right.
So we talk a lot about brand building, but also we got to really focus on, do you meet or exceed whatever that brand is, once they come into the reality of the actual people that that brand is representing. So
Yeah,
that's the other important part.
that's really interesting. I've got a friend that I do a lot of work with, and he's playing with this idea of brand believability. Um,
Oh yeah, I like that.
Which I think is really like that. That's the litmus test, right? Is do we believe the brand for, I mean, a lot of companies have built brands and then they've behaved in certain ways that have destroyed that brand, right? And
Right.
so, can you believe in it? And I think that's what you're getting at, which is critical.
And brand is just not business. Brand is your personal brand. For my book, Principles of Winning, number one is all you have is your name and your word, and basically what it boils down to, that's your brand. And what are you representing? How are you representing yourself? How are people looking at you? And how are you looking at yourself and defining yourself for how you want people to look at you? Like you,
Mhm.
I think you mentioned this. We can't dictate how people think about us, but we can influence it. We can influence
Yeah.
it in a lot of different ways by the interactions that we have, by how people see us show up on a platform like this. So I believe that leadership and brand, those are two big components of whether you're going to make it or you're not going to make it. How you're perceived and how you actually go about doing the work and putting yourself into the market and executing on whatever it is that people are perceiving about you. Um, I want to say this. One of my reasons for doing what I do with these interviews is for selfish and personal reasons. I feel like the last 15 minutes specifically was worth like going to a business course and learning some part of business.
Hmm.
That's why I do this. But then the other part of this is, hey Andrew, how many people can talk to you and get this amount of time from you? You can't do this every day with
No.
everybody who wants it, right?
No.
So the reason principles of winning is here is so we can bring these type of conversations to the market. And I really hope and I'm really confident that these conversations are going to help other people learn something new, maybe reframe or refocus or get a more clear perspective or sharpen their perspective from perspectives of other people, right? And the last thing I want to say is I want to thank you because this has been very enlightening for me. I've learned a few things. Um, I hope that other people will learn a few things. But before we sign off, I want to ask you, is there anything that we missed out on that you would say, hey, personally, professionally, if you want to be successful from your point of view, from your experiences, if you want to win in life from your point of view and your experiences, here's something else that I want to add before we click off.
Yeah, that's well. First of all, again, thank you for the opportunity. I enjoy doing stuff like this. You're right; I couldn't do it every day. So I hope somebody finds some value in this. Um, I think it's this. I think that it's really hard to be successful in life if you're not present, if you don't really buy into what you're doing.
Mhm.
You know, everybody has to do things from time to time that aren't that much fun. You got to find a way to break through that and to get it done with the same level of verve that you do the stuff that you really like to do. I don't care what field you're in. And I think that all of the things that you hear, hard work, perseverance, all of those things, I think they're all important. You need a little bit of luck, but when that door opens, man, you got to go through. You got to go through. You got to recognize it. You got to be, and I think to do that, you have to be present. You have to be, paying attention and engaged. Right? It's really hard, to be successful if you're not fully engaged in what you're trying to do. And I do worry a little bit about, these generations coming up and the impact that cell phones have And I probably sound old saying this, but they run the risk of destroying our ability to be present, whether they're in relationships, whether they're in jobs, whether regardless of what they're doing. So I think that's an important lesson. You can't get past hard work, but work has to be fun. And I think just driving away at something for the sake of it is not necessarily the best way to get things done. Be clear about what your objectives are. Somebody said to me once, in the hallways of Bombardier, I ran into one of the group presidents, and he said, "How you doing?" I said, "Oh man, I'm so busy. I don't know, sort of which way did." He looked at me and he said, "You can do 3 things a day. You just got to choose the right 3 things." And I don't know why, certain things stick in your head. And I found freedom in that. And so, I start every day by trying to figure out what those 3 things are going to be. And then if I can get above and beyond that, terrific. But, it's little things like that that I think make a difference. I do want to say in closing that, I am digging into your book. I'm a couple of chapters in and found it really interesting. I think the platform you're building here is really positive, and I think it's important, and I think we need more of this. So I commend you on that. And I don't necessarily like to do this, but I ended up doing most of the talking here today. But
Yeah.
anybody who knows me will say that's BS. But anyways, I did learn a lot from you as well today, and I thank you for that. But I think the platform you're building is great, and I'm honored that you asked me to come on.
Absolutely. And I'm very, very thankful that you looked at that message on LinkedIn, said, I'll connect with this guy. And then you
Sure.
looked at another message and said, I'll read that. Okay, that's interesting. I'll answer that question. And then after that, it was like, okay, I answered this question and now he's coming back and asking me for some of my time. You gave me a little bit of your time, and then it ended up here. And I say that to other people out there, hey, cultivate relationships. It wasn't just a, hey, would you come on this podcast for me? It was very strategic. How do I get from point A to point B? I want to bring C-level people, entrepreneurs, politicians on. How do I get to point A to point B? Well, I just try to connect. Everybody's not going to connect. Hey, let me try to engage with them with something that will, they'll be interested in. And then let me go back and read that and really, hey, am I interested in their in how they perceive whatever that was? And if I am, let me come back to them and tell them how interested I was on it, and say that, and then say, hey, I would like to talk to you more about that. Everybody's not going to do it. Some people will. And then have a one-on-one if they have time, and then just build with someone, and then you get this. But again, Andrew, I appreciate it very, very much. This has been a wonderful conversation, and you have given us your principles of winning. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And every week, Wednesday, 12 noon, we drop another episode of Principles of Winning. So go not like I'll subscribe to our YouTube channel. Go and subscribe to our podcast. We appreciate you, and we see you next week.